The sun was setting behind the red rocks of Canyon Ridge when Margaret pulled the leather strap from the kitchen drawer for the third time that week. Her face was twisted with anger as she held it in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of it. The sound of broken pottery still echoed in the small kitchen where Ayanna knelt on the wooden floor, carefully picking up pieces of what used to be a water pitcher. Canyon Ridge wasn't much to look at in 1887, just a handful of buildings, scattered across the dusty Arizona territory, where the wind never seemed to stop blowing and the sun beat down on everything with no mercy. Most folks who ended up there were running from something or looking for something they couldn't find anywhere else. Margaret Whitmore was both. She had married Thomas Whitmore 6 months ago, not for love, but for security. At 32, Margaret knew her options were running thin back in Denver. Her first husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with nothing but debts and a bitter taste in her mouth about how unfair life could be. When Thomas had come through town looking for a wife to help run his trading post, Margaret saw her chance and took it. Thomas was a good man, everyone said so. He treated the local native tribes with respect, paid fair prices for their goods, and never cheated anyone out of an honest deal. His trading post was the heart of Canyon Ridge, where people came not just to buy supplies but to catch up on news and share stories. He had built something real in this harsh land, something that mattered. But Thomas was gone most of the time, traveling to other settlements and meeting with tribal leaders to expand his business. That left Margaret alone in a house that never felt like home, in a town where she felt like an outsider with responsibilities she never wanted, and it left her alone with Ayanna. Ayanna was 19 years old, though her eyes held the weight of someone much older. She was Hopi, from a village about 50 miles south where the crops had failed 3 years running. When her family faced starvation, Thomas had offered her work and fair wages to help his household. It was an arrangement that benefited everyone. Ayanna could send money home to help her family survive, and Thomas got help managing his home and business. Thomas treated Ayanna with the same respect he showed everyone. She wasn't just hired help to him, she was a person with dignity and worth. He made sure she had her own room, time to practice her traditions, and freedom to visit her family when needed. It was more kindness than many native people found in those days. But Margaret saw things differently. Every time she looked at Ayanna, she saw everything that was wrong with her new life. She saw Thomas's respect for people Margaret thought were beneath them. She saw the way the young woman moved through the house with quiet grace, never complaining, never demanding anything. It made Margaret feel small and ugly inside, and she hated that feeling, so she found reasons to be angry. If Ayanna spoke even a word of Hopi while working, Margaret would fly into a rage. "English only in this house," she would shout, even though Thomas had never made such a rule. If Ayanna smiled while working, Margaret would accuse her of being lazy and not taking her duties seriously. If she looked sad, Margaret would call her ungrateful for the opportunity she had been given. The broken pitcher was just the latest excuse. Ayanna had been carrying water from the well when a dog ran across her path, startling her. The heavy clay pitcher slipped from her wet hands and shattered on the stone step. It was an accident, the kind that could happen to anyone. But Margaret had been watching from the window, and she saw only disobedience and carelessness. "Get up," Margaret said now, her voice cold and sharp. "Leave those pieces." Ayanna rose slowly, her dark eyes calm despite what she knew was coming. She had learned not to show fear or anger, not to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her break. In her culture, enduring hardship with dignity was a sign of strength, and she would not dishonor her family by begging or crying. "Do you know how much that pitcher cost?" Margaret demanded, though she had no idea herself. Thomas handled all the household purchases when he was in town. "I am sorry," Ayanna said quietly. "It was an accident. I will work extra hours to pay for a new one." "Sorry doesn't fix broken pottery," Margaret snapped. "And extra hours don't teach you to be more careful." The first blow came across Ayanna's back, sharp and sudden. The young woman tensed but didn't cry out. The second blow followed quickly, then a third. Margaret put all her frustration and bitterness into each strike. Her anger at Thomas for leaving her alone, her resentment at being trapped in this dusty nowhere town, her fury at feeling powerless in her own life. But mostly, she struck out at Ayanna because she could, because no one was there to stop her, because in this one small way, Margaret could feel like she had control over something. The beating lasted only a few minutes, but it felt longer to both women. When Margaret finally stopped, breathing hard from the effort, Ayanna remained standing. Her back burned with pain, but she kept her head high. She had endured worse hardships than this angry woman could imagine. "Clean up this mess," Margaret said, trying to steady her voice. "And be more careful next time." Ayanna nodded and knelt back down to gather the pottery pieces. Margaret watched her for a moment, expecting tears or pleas for mercy that never came. The young woman's quiet strength only made her angrier, but she was tired now, and the moment had passed. This wasn't the first time. It had started small, harsh words and impossible standards. Margaret would find fault with everything Ayanna did. The floors weren't clean enough. The meals weren't prepared exactly right. The wash wasn't hung properly. Nothing was ever good enough. When words stopped being enough to release Margaret's anger, she had turned to punishment. A slap here, a shove there. Always when Thomas was away, always with warnings that telling him would only make things worse. "He won't believe a word you say," Margaret would whisper after each incident. And even if he did, what do you think he would choose? His wife or his hired help? Ayanna never tested that threat. She knew her position was fragile, and her family needed the money she sent home. She had nowhere else to go, no other options for work that would pay enough to help her people survive. So she endured, day after day, storing up each cruelty like stones in her heart. The other people in Canyon Ridge didn't know what happened inside the Whitmore house when Thomas was away. They saw Margaret as the respectable wife of an important businessman. She was always polite in public, always properly dressed and well-spoken. She attended the small church services and contributed to community events. And they saw Ayanna as just the hired help, quiet, efficient, and unremarkable. In a time and place where Native people were often treated as invisible, no one looked closely enough to notice the careful way she moved, or the shadows that sometimes flickered across her face. Even Doc Henderson, who treated everyone in town, regardless of their ability to pay, never saw the marks Margaret's strap left on Ayanna's back and arms. The young woman was careful to keep them hidden, wearing long sleeves even in the desert heat and never complaining of pain that might require medical attention. Thomas himself remained unaware of what was happening in his absence. When he returned, from his trading trips, he found his household running smoothly and his wife in good spirits. Margaret was always careful to be especially kind to Ayanna when her husband was home, sometimes even praising her work in front of him. "We're so fortunate to have such reliable help," she would say, placing a gentle hand on Ayanna's shoulder while her eyes promised consequences if the young woman ever revealed the truth. Ayanna would nod and smile, playing her part in the deception. What else could she do? Thomas was a good man, but he was also a white man in 1887 Arizona, and his wife was a white woman. The word of a Hopi servant against a respectable married lady would mean nothing in any court or council that mattered. So the cruel routine continued. Thomas would leave on business, always apologetic about the long absences, but explaining they were necessary to keep the trading post profitable. Margaret would watch his wagon disappear down the dusty road, then turn back to the house with anticipation already building in her chest. And Ayanna would brace herself for whatever small mistake or imagined slight would trigger the next explosion of violence. The leather strap hung by the kitchen door like a constant reminder of Margaret's power. Sometimes she would touch it while giving Ayanna instructions, just to see the young woman's eyes flicker with recognition. Other times, she would clean it carefully, making sure Ayanna could see her doing it. "A well-maintained tool lasts longer," Margaret would say with a cold smile. "Don't you think? Winter was the worst time. The trading routes became difficult to travel, so Thomas stayed away for weeks at a time. The isolation and cold made everyone irritable, but Margaret's moods grew especially dark during the long, empty days. She would pace the house like a caged animal, finding fault with everything and everyone. Ayanna learned to move like a ghost during these periods, trying to be invisible while still completing all her duties. She cooked meals that Margaret barely touched, cleaned rooms that were already spotless, and mended clothes with stitches so small they were almost impossible to see. Nothing she did was ever quite right, but she kept trying because the alternative was giving up entirely. On the coldest nights, Kale Bege moved through the morning mist like he was part of it, his moccasins silent on the frost-covered ground. The deer trail he followed wound between the red rocks and scrub brush, leading him closer to the white settlement than he usually traveled. But the wounded buck he'd been tracking for 2 days had wandered far from its usual territory, and Kale wouldn't give up when his family needed the meat. At 26, Kale was considered one of the finest hunters among the Navajo people. His grandfather had taught him to read the land like others read books. Every broken twig, every disturbed pebble, every change in the wind told a story. He could track a rabbit across solid rock or find water in places where others saw only endless desert. But it wasn't just his hunting skills that made him respected. Kale had learned to speak English from the traders who sometimes visited his people, and he understood the white world better than most. He served as a bridge between his community and the outside world, helping to negotiate peaceful agreements and fair trades. His people trusted him because he never forgot who he was or where he came from, no matter how well he could navigate the white man's world. And the more reasonable white settlers respected him because he always dealt honestly and kept his word. The trail led him to a rocky outcrop that overlooked Canyon Ridge. Kyle crouched behind a boulder and studied the small settlement below. He'd been here before, trading with Thomas Whitmore, who was known among the tribes as a fair man. Unlike many white traders, Thomas never tried to cheat them or sell them spoiled goods. He paid honest prices and treated everyone with dignity. Kyle could see the Whitmore house clearly from his position. It was larger than the other buildings, built of adobe brick with a red tile roof that Thomas had hauled all the way from Santa Fe. Behind it was a small garden where vegetables grew in neat rows, and beyond that, the well that supplied water to the household. The wounded deer's trail continued down toward the settlement, which meant Kale would have to wait. He couldn't risk taking a shot so close to the houses, not just because it might frighten people, but because the white authorities were always looking for excuses to cause trouble for his people. A Navajo hunter shooting near a white settlement could be twisted into something dangerous, no matter how innocent the reality. So he settled in to wait and watch, hoping the deer would move away from the buildings before his patience ran out. His family had been living on corn and beans for too long. The meat from this buck would feed them for weeks and provide hides for the winter clothing they desperately needed. As the sun climbed higher, Kale noticed movement around the Whitmore house. A young woman came out to tend the garden, moving with the graceful efficiency he recognized in his own people. Even from a distance, he could tell she was native, probably Hopi, judging by her dress and the way she wore her hair. This must be the girl Thomas had hired to help with his household. Kale had heard about her from other traders who passed through the area. The arrangement had surprised some people, but Thomas had always been different from other white men. He saw people as people, not just as colors or tribes. The young woman worked steadily in the garden, pulling weeds and checking the winter vegetables that were struggling to survive the cold. She moved carefully, as if every motion was planned and deliberate. There was something about her posture that reminded Kale of a deer that knew wolves were nearby, alert and ready to run at the first sign of danger. A white woman emerged from the house, and Kale could see immediately that this must be Thomas's new wife. He'd heard about the marriage from other traders but had never seen the woman before. She stood on the porch with her hands on her hips, watching the girl in the garden with an expression that even from a distance looked hostile. The white woman called out something that Kale couldn't hear, but he could see the effect it had on the young native woman. Her shoulders tensed and she moved more quickly as if trying to finish her work before something bad happened. This bothered Kale more than he could explain. In his culture, people worked together to survive. Everyone had their role, and everyone was respected for their contribution. A woman tending a garden was doing important work that fed the community. She deserved gratitude, not hostility. The white woman went back inside, and the girl continued her work. But Kale noticed that she kept glancing toward the house like she was expecting trouble. Her movements became more hurried, less graceful. Whatever was happening inside that house, it wasn't good. The wounded deer had bedded down in a thicket of mesquite about half a mile from the settlement. Kyle could see it clearly through his grandfather's old spyglass, but it was still too close to the houses for a safe shot. He would have to wait until it moved, or until he could find a way to approach from a different angle. Hours passed. The sun reached its peak and started its journey toward the western horizon. Kyle remained motionless behind his boulder, patient as stone. His grandfather had taught him that hunting was mostly waiting, and that the hunter who couldn't sit still would always go hungry. But his attention kept drifting back to the Whitmore house. Something was wrong there, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The young woman had gone inside, and the house looked peaceful from the outside. But Kyle's instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle signs of danger in the wilderness, told him that appearances could be deceiving. Then he heard it. The sound was faint, carried on the wind that blew up from the settlement. At first he thought it might be someone chopping wood or working leather, but there was a rhythm to it that made his blood run cold. The sharp crack of something striking flesh, followed by a pause, then another crack. And underneath it, so quiet he almost missed it, the sound of someone trying not to cry out in pain. Kyle's hands clenched around his rifle. He'd heard those sounds before, during the worst times when the soldiers came to his people's territory. He knew the difference between the sound of work and the sound of violence, and this was definitely violence. Without thinking, he left his position and moved down the slope toward the settlement. He kept to the shadows between rocks and bushes, using skills his grandfather had taught him for approaching game without being detected. But now he was hunting something far more dangerous than any deer. The sound stopped as he got closer, but they had been coming from the Whitmore house. Kyle worked his way around to the back, where a small window looked into what appeared to be the kitchen. Through the glass he could see movement inside. What he saw made his jaw clench with anger. The young Hopi woman knelt on the kitchen floor, her back to the window. Even through her dress, Kyle could see the tension in her shoulders, and the way she held herself like someone trying to deal with pain. Standing over her was the white woman, holding a leather strap in her hand like a weapon. The white woman was speaking, her mouth moving in words Kyle couldn't hear, but whose tone was unmistakably cruel. The girl remained motionless, not responding, which seemed to make the white woman even angrier. Then it happened again. The strap came down across the girl's back with a sharp crack that Kyle could hear even through the window. The girl's body jerked with the impact, but she didn't cry out. She just knelt there, absorbing the pain in silence. Kyle had seen enough violence in his life to know real cruelty when he saw it. This wasn't punishment for some serious wrongdoing. This was just cruelty for its own sake. The white woman was enjoying the power she had over someone who couldn't fight back. Everything in Kyle's nature screamed at him to act. His people were taught that protecting those who couldn't protect themselves was one of the highest duties a person could have. But he also knew that interfering in white people's business could bring terrible consequences, not just for him, but for his entire community. If he burst into that house and stopped what was happening, he would be just another savage attacking a white woman. It wouldn't matter that he was trying to help. It wouldn't matter that what the woman was doing was wrong. All that would matter to the white authorities was that a native man had laid hands on a white woman, and that was a killing offense in this time and place. But watching and doing nothing felt like a betrayal of everything he'd been taught about honor and duty. The beating continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When it finally stopped, the white woman hung the strap on a hook by the door and left the room. The girl remained kneeling for a long moment, then slowly stood and began cleaning up broken pieces of pottery that were scattered across the floor. Even through the window, Kyle could see that her hands were shaking, but her face remained calm and dignified, showing no trace of the pain she must be feeling. This impressed him more than he could say. In his culture, the ability to endure suffering without losing one's dignity was considered one of the greatest strengths a person could have, but it also made him angrier. This young woman had done nothing to deserve such treatment. She was working hard, trying to help her family survive, and instead of gratitude or even basic human decency, she was receiving cruelty that would have shamed any honorable person. Cale watched until the girl finished cleaning and left the kitchen. Then he carefully made his way back to his original position on the ridge. But he could no longer concentrate on hunting. For 3 days, Cale couldn't sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the leather strap coming down and heard that terrible sound it made when it hit. The image of the young Hopi woman kneeling in silence, taking the beating without, crying out, haunted him like nothing ever had before. He'd returned to his family settlement, but his mind remained back at Canyon Ridge. His younger sister, Atakai, noticed something was wrong almost immediately. She found him sitting by their small fire on the second night, staring into the flames with an expression she'd never seen before. "Brother," she said softly, settling down beside him. "What troubles you?" Cale looked at her, barely 18, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that reminded everyone why her name meant she plays in their language. Atakai had always been the joy of their family, the one who could make anyone laugh even in the darkest times. But looking at her now, Cale saw something else. Vulnerability. If his sister were alone and helpless in a white settlement, if someone was hurting her while she tried to earn money to help their family survive, what would he want someone to do? The answer was simple and immediate. "There's a girl," he said finally. "Hopi. Working for the trader in Canyon Ridge. Someone is hurting." Her Atakai's expression grew serious. She knew her brother well enough to understand that he wouldn't be this troubled unless the situation was truly bad. Hurting her how? Cale told her what he'd witnessed, choosing his words carefully, but not hiding the reality of what he'd seen. When he finished, Atakai was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but I have to do something." Atakai nodded slowly. "Our grandfather would say that the spirits put you there at that moment for a reason. Maybe this is your test." That night, Cale talked with his uncle, a wise man who had dealt with white officials before and understood their ways better than most. His uncle listened carefully to the whole story, asking questions and considering the situation from every angle. "This is dangerous ground you're thinking of walking on," his uncle warned. "White women are protected by laws that don't protect our women. If you accuse her directly, they will never believe you. And if you try to stop her physically, they will hang you." "So I should do nothing?" Cale asked, though he already knew his uncle wouldn't counsel complete inaction. "I didn't say that. But you must be very careful how you proceed. Sometimes the indirect path is the only safe one." His uncle suggested that Cale approach Thomas Whitmore directly, since the trader had a reputation for fairness. But Cale had already considered and rejected that option. Thomas was often away on business, and even if he believed the accusations against his wife, confronting her might only make things worse for the Hopi girl. On the third day, Cale made his decision. He would confront the white woman directly, but not with violence or accusations that could be denied. Instead, he would use the one weapon that might work against someone like her: fear of consequences she hadn't considered. He spent that morning preparing carefully. He cleaned his rifle until it gleamed, not because he planned to use it, but because it was part of the image he needed to project. He dressed in his finest clothes, beaded leather shirt, silver jewelry his grandmother had made, and the eagle feather his grandfather had given him when he proved himself as a hunter. When he looked at himself in the still water of a stream, he saw what he intended white people to see: a proud Navajo warrior who commanded respect and possibly fear. It wasn't the whole truth of who he was, but it was one facet of his identity that might serve him well in what was to come. The ride to Canyon Ridge took most of the day. Cale pushed his horse hard, arriving in the settlement just as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. He could see smoke rising from the chimney of the Whitmore house, which meant someone was home. He dismounted at the edge of town and walked his horse through the dusty streets. Several white residents stopped what they were doing to stare at him. It wasn't unusual to see Navajo people in Canyon Ridge. Thomas's fair dealing had brought many tribal members to trade at his post. But there was something different about Cale's bearing today, something that made people take notice. He tied his horse to the rail outside the Whitmore house and stood for a moment, gathering his courage. What he was about to do could go wrong, in so many ways. The white woman might refuse to talk to him. She might call for help and claim he was threatening her. She might dismiss everything he said and take her anger out on the girl later. But doing nothing was no longer an option. Cale walked up to the front door and knocked 3 times, firm and deliberate. He could hear movement inside, footsteps approaching. Then the door opened and he found himself face to face with Margaret Whitmore. She was smaller than he'd expected, a thin woman with sharp features and cold blue eyes. Her dress was expensive, but practical, and her hair was pulled back in a severe style that made her look older than she probably was. When she saw who was at her door, her expression shifted quickly from curiosity to suspicion to something that might have been fear. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice sharp with authority she didn't quite feel. Cale studied her for a moment before responding. Up close he could see the hardness in her face, the lines around her mouth that spoke of frequent anger and dissatisfaction. This was not a woman who had found happiness or peace in her life, and that made her dangerous to anyone weaker than herself. "I have come to speak about the treatment of the Hopi woman in your house," he said in careful English, his voice calm and steady. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed red. "How dare you? What business is it of yours how I manage my own household?" "It becomes my business when that management involves cruelty," Cale replied evenly. "Get off my property this instant or I'll call for the sheriff." But even as she made the threat, Margaret was backing away from the door. There was something about the tall Navajo man that made her nervous. It wasn't just his size, though he was certainly imposing. It was the quiet confidence in his voice, the way he looked at her with eyes that seemed to see right through her pretenses. "You may call whoever you wish," Cale said, not moving from the doorway. "But first you should know that what you have been doing has not gone unnoticed." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I have seen how you treat the young woman who works in your house. I have witnessed the leather strap and heard the sounds it makes when you use it." Margaret's face went from red to white in an instant. "You were spying on me?" "I was tracking wounded game that led me near your house. What I saw was impossible to ignore." There was a long silence. Margaret was clearly trying to decide whether to continue denying everything or to try a different approach. Cale waited patiently, letting her struggle with the decision. He'd learned from hunting that sometimes the best strategy was to remain still and let your quarry make the mistakes. Finally, Margaret spoke again, but her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. "What I do in my own home is my business. That girl works for me, and if she needs discipline, that's my right." "Is it?" Cale asked quietly. "Because I wonder if your husband knows about this discipline. I wonder if the other traders who do business with him know. I wonder if the tribal councils who send people to work in white settlements know how those people are treated." Now Margaret was definitely afraid. Cale could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she kept glancing over his shoulder, as if looking for help that wasn't coming. "You can't prove anything," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Can't I? The girl bears the marks of your strap. Doc Henderson would recognize the signs if he examined her. And there are people in this town who have noticed things. The way she moves carefully like someone in pain. The way she flinches when you speak to her. The way she's grown thin and quiet since you arrived." This last part was mostly bluff. Cale had no idea whether anyone in town had noticed these things. But he was betting that Margaret's guilty conscience would make her believe it was possible. He was right. Margaret's face crumpled slightly, and she looked around nervously as if she expected to see neighbors watching from their windows. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want it to stop," Cale said simply. "The girl is under the protection of my people now. Harm her again, and there will be consequences." "Are you threatening me?" "I am informing you of a new reality. The Hopi and Navajo tribes have many connections to the white settlements in this territory. We know which traders are honest and which are not. We know which settlements welcome our business and which ones don't. Your husband has built his success on our trust and respect. Kyle paused, letting this sink in before continuing. If word spreads that Thomas Whitmore's household is a place where Native people are abused, how long do you think that trust will last? How long before other tribes stop trading here? How long before your husband's business begins to fail? Margaret was breathing quickly now, like someone who had just realized she was standing on the edge of a cliff. He would never believe you over me. I'm his wife. Perhaps not, but doubt once planted has a way of growing, and if the abuse continues, the proof will become harder to hide. Injuries that can't be explained away. Witnesses who will be believed because they have no reason to lie. The change in the Whitmore household was immediate and unsettling. For the first time in months, Ayanna woke up without dread in her stomach. She lay in her small bed, listening to the familiar sounds of morning, birds singing outside her window, the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees, and realized something was different. Margaret hadn't spoken to her since the Navajo man's visit 3 days ago. Not a word of criticism, not a harsh command, not even acknowledgement of her presence. Margaret had taken her meals in her room, leaving Ayanna to manage the household entirely on her own. The leather strap still hung by the kitchen door, but it might as well have been invisible for all the attention Margaret paid to it. Ayanna had no idea who the man was or what he had said to Margaret, but she understood that something fundamental had shifted. She moved through her daily tasks with growing amazement, hardly daring to believe that the constant threat of violence had simply disappeared. But she also knew better than to trust this new peace completely. In her experience, calm could be the moment before the worst storms. On the 4th day, Thomas Whitmore returned from his trading expedition. Ayanna heard his wagon coming up the road long before it reached the house. She was hanging laundry behind the kitchen when the familiar sound of wheels and horses reached her ears. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. What would Thomas see when he looked at her? Would he notice that something had changed? Would Margaret tell him some twisted version of recent events? Thomas appeared around the corner of the house, leading his tired horses toward the small barn. He was a tall man in his 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into the desert sun. His clothes were dusty from the road, and he looked exhausted but satisfied, the expression of a man whose business had gone well. "Ayanna," he called out cheerfully. "Good to see you. How have things been while I was away?" "Fine, Mr. Thomas," she replied carefully. "No problems." He studied her face for a moment, and she wondered if he could see the changes there. She felt different, less tense, less afraid, and she worried that it might be obvious. "You look well," he said finally. "Actually, you look better than when I left. The work hasn't been too hard for you?" "No, sir. Mrs. Margaret has been. She has given me lighter duties lately." This was true, though only because Margaret had barely spoken to her at all. Ayanna had been managing the household according to her own judgment, doing the work that needed to be done without constant criticism and impossible demands. Thomas nodded, seeming pleased. Good. Margaret's a practical woman. She knows the value of treating good help well. If only he knew, Ayanna thought. But she just smiled and went back to hanging clothes while Thomas took care of his horses. An hour later, she heard raised voices coming from inside the house. Thomas and Margaret were arguing, their voices carrying through the thin walls despite their obvious attempts to keep the conversation private. Ayanna couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Thomas was angry about something, and Margaret was defensive. The argument went on for nearly an hour. Several times one of them would raise their voice enough for Ayanna to catch fragments. "Can't believe you would," and "not your business to," and "reputation in this community." When the voices finally stopped, an uncomfortable silence settled over the house. Ayanna continued her work, trying to make herself invisible while wondering what would happen next. The answer came at dinner time. Thomas emerged from the house looking grim but determined. He found Ayanna in the kitchen, where she was preparing the evening meal. "Ayanna," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." Has my wife been treating you badly while I've been away? Ayana's hand stilled on the vegetables she was cutting. This was the moment she'd dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. Thomas was giving her a chance to tell the truth, but she knew that truth could destroy his marriage and possibly make her situation even worse. "Sir?" she said, stalling for time. "I've heard some things," Thomas continued, "from people in town, about how you've been, about marks they've seen on your arms, about the way you've been moving like someone in pain." So the Navajo man had been right. People had noticed. The realization filled Ayana with a mixture of shame and relief. She wasn't as invisible as she'd thought, but that also meant her suffering hadn't been entirely hidden. She began, then stopped. The habit of protecting Margaret, of keeping the peace at any cost, was hard to break. Thomas stepped closer, his expression gentle but serious. "Ayana, you've been with this household for months now. You've been honest and hardworking, and you've never caused any trouble. If something has been happening to you, I need to know about it." The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than Margaret's cruelty had been. Ayana felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks. Ayana's voice came out, as barely a whisper. "She was angry often, when you were away. Everything I did was wrong." "Did she hurt you?" The simple question hung in the air between them. Ayana looked into Thomas's face and saw genuine concern, real caring. This man had given her work when her family was starving. He had treated her with respect from the very beginning. He deserved the truth. "Yes," she said simply. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw clenching. "How badly?" "The strap, by the kitchen door. For every mistake, every broken dish, every time she thought I was too slow or spoke in my own language." "Show me." Ayana hesitated, then slowly rolled up her sleeves. The marks had mostly faded by now, but there were still faint bruises and thin scars that told the story of Margaret's systematic cruelty. Thomas examined her arms carefully, his face growing darker with each mark he saw. When he finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I should have seen this, I should have known." "You were not here to see," Ayana replied. "And I did not want to cause trouble." "Trouble?" Thomas looked at her, with amazement. "Ayana, none of this was your fault, none of it. You've been working hard to help your family, and instead of gratitude, you received cruelty. That's not trouble. That's injustice." He paced to the window and back, clearly struggling with strong emotions. "The people who told me about this, they said it stopped recently. Is that true?" "Yes, sir. 3 days ago." "What happened 3 days ago?" Ayana told him about the Navajo visitor, about seeing him leave the house and noticing that Margaret's behavior had changed completely afterward. She didn't know who the man was or exactly what he'd said, but his intervention had clearly had an effect. Thomas listened intently, nodding slowly. "Cale Begay," he said when she finished. "That must have been Cale. He's a good man, well respected among his people. If he took the trouble to come here and speak with Margaret, he must have witnessed what was happening. You know him? We've done business together. He helps facilitate trades between my post and various tribal communities. He's always been fair and honest in his dealings." Thomas paused. "And he's not someone who would interfere lightly. If he came here, it's because he saw something that deeply troubled him." Thomas was quiet for another long moment, staring out the window toward the mountains where the sun was beginning to set. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with sadness and anger. "Margaret will be leaving," he said simply. Ayana felt her heart skip. "Sir? My wife will be departing Canyon Ridge tomorrow morning. Our marriage is over." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Ayana had hoped for many things, for the abuse to stop, for protection, for simple dignity, but she had never imagined that Thomas would actually end his marriage over her treatment. "Because of me?" she asked, horrified at the thought. "No," Thomas said firmly. "Because of her choices. Because of what she chose to do when she thought no one was watching. because of who she revealed herself to be when she had power over someone who couldn't fight back. He turned to face Ayanna directly. You did nothing wrong. You were working honestly to help your family survive. You deserved protection and respect, and instead you received cruelty. That's not on you. That's on me for not seeing it, and it's on her for doing it. Thomas explained that he had built his business on trust and fair dealing with people from many different communities. His reputation was everything in this harsh land where survival often depended on cooperation and mutual respect. If word spreads that my household is a place where Native people are mistreated, he said, it won't just hurt my business. It will hurt the relationships I've spent years building. It will make it harder for other Native people to find work with white families. It will damage the fragile peace we've managed to create in this territory. But more than that, Thomas explained, he simply couldn't live with a woman who was capable of such systematic cruelty. I thought I knew who Margaret was when I married her, he said. I thought she was a practical woman who understood the realities of life out here. I never imagined she was someone who would take pleasure in hurting others. That evening, Thomas had a final conversation with Margaret. Ayanna didn't hear the details, but she could tell from the tone that it was definitive. Margaret would leave the next morning with enough money to start over somewhere else, but she would not be returning to Canyon Ridge. Spring came early to Canyon Ridge that year, bringing with it changes that no one could have predicted just a few months before. The harsh winter that had trapped everyone in their homes and their routines was finally over, and the desert began to bloom with surprising color and life. Ayanna stood in the garden behind the Whitmore house, watching tiny green shoots push their way up through the dark soil. She had planted these seeds herself, choosing varieties that would grow well in the difficult climate and provide food for the household through the coming year. For the first time since she'd come to work for Thomas, she felt like she had a real stake in the future of this place. 3 months had passed since Margaret's departure, and the house felt completely different. The constant tension that had filled every room was gone, replaced by a peaceful quiet that Ayanna had learned to trust. She no longer woke up each morning wondering what small mistake would bring punishment. Instead, she woke up planning the day's work and looking forward to accomplishing things that mattered. Thomas had kept his promise about treating her with respect and dignity. Her wages had increased, her workload had become reasonable, and she was consulted about household decisions, rather than simply being ordered to carry them out. More importantly, she was allowed to be herself, to speak Hopi when she wanted to practice her traditions, and to maintain connections with her own people. But the most unexpected change had come from an entirely different direction. Cale. Begay had returned to Canyon Ridge several times since his confrontation with Margaret. Initially, his visits had been for business, helping Thomas establish new trading relationships with Navajo communities, and ensuring that the arrangement with Ayanna was working out as promised. But gradually, his reasons for coming had become more personal. It started with small gestures. He would bring news from her village, letting her know that her family was doing well with the money she sent home. He brought traditional foods that reminded her of home, and once a beautiful piece of pottery made by her grandmother. These gifts weren't romantic courtship in the white sense, but they showed a thoughtfulness and care that touched Ayanna deeply. Thomas had noticed the developing friendship with approval. Kyle was well respected in the community, and his continued presence around the trading post was good for business. More than that, Thomas could see that Ayanna was happier when Cale was around. She smiled more, laughed occasionally, and seemed to be healing from the trauma of her experiences with Margaret. The turning point came on a warm afternoon in late April. Cale had arrived with a group of Navajo traders, and while the business was being conducted, he and Ayanna found themselves working together in the garden. She was showing him the vegetables she'd planted, explaining how she'd adapted traditional Hopi growing techniques to the slightly different soil and climate around Canyon Ridge. Your people are known for their skill with growing things, Cale said, kneeling beside her to examine a row of young corn plants. Even in the hardest places, the Hopi find ways to make things grow. It is what we have always done, Ayanna replied. My grandmother says that plants are like people. They can survive almost anything if they have good roots and someone who cares for them. Cale looked at her thoughtfully. You have good roots, and now you have people who care for you. The simple words carried a weight of meaning that made Ayana's heart skip. She looked into his dark eyes and saw something there that she'd been afraid to hope for: genuine affection, respect, and the possibility of a future she'd never dared to imagine. I think, Kyle said carefully, that I would like to care for you for a very long time. It was a gentle declaration, spoken in the way of their people rather than the dramatic style favored by white society. But Ayana understood perfectly, and her smile was all the answer Kale needed. Their courtship progressed slowly and respectfully, in full view of both communities. Thomas gave his blessing enthusiastically, seeing it as a wonderful development for both young people. The tribal elders from both the Hopi and Navajo communities approved of the match, recognizing that such unions could strengthen the bonds between their peoples. By midsummer, plans were being made for a wedding that would honor both traditions. It would be held in Canyon Ridge, with Thomas hosting the celebration at his trading post. Representatives from both tribal communities would attend, along with the white residents who had come to respect and appreciate Ayana's gentle presence in their settlement. But before the wedding could take place, there was one more important change to make. On a hot July morning, Thomas called Ayana and Kale to join him on the porch of his house. In his hands was a leather strap, the same one Margaret had used to beat Ayana during those dark winter months. I've been thinking about this, Thomas said, holding up the strap, about what it represents and what we should do with it. Ayana looked at the piece of leather that had caused her so much pain and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no desire for revenge. It was just a piece of leather now, powerless to hurt her. What do you think should happen to it? Thomas asked. Kyle spoke first. In my people's tradition, when something has been used to cause harm, it should be cleansed by fire. The smoke carries the bad spirits away and the ashes fertilize new growth. Ayana nodded slowly. My people believe that all suffering serves a purpose, even when we cannot see it at the time. Perhaps this thing served its purpose by bringing us all together. Thomas smiled. Then let's put it to a better use. That evening, as the sun set behind the red rocks of Canyon Ridge, a small ceremony took place in the yard behind the Whitmore house. Members of both tribal communities were present, along with Doc Henderson, the local minister, and several other white residents who had come to respect the unusual household that Thomas had created. The leather strap was placed on a small fire that Kale had built using traditional methods. As it burned, sending smoke up into the darkening sky, Ayana spoke a Hopi blessing for the release of old pain and the welcoming of new joy. Kale added a Navajo prayer for healing and protection. Thomas watched the smoke rise and thought about the strange chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. Margaret's cruelty had led to Kale's intervention, which had led to her departure, which had created the space for healing and new relationships to develop. It wasn't that the suffering had been good or necessary, but that good people had found ways to transform it into something better. When the strap was completely consumed, its ashes were mixed with water and poured around the roots of a young cottonwood tree that Ayana had planted near the garden. In years to come, that tree would grow tall and strong, providing shade and shelter for future generations who would never know what had fertilized its early growth. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, on a perfect August morning when the desert air was clear and the mountains stood out sharp against the blue sky. Ayana wore a traditional Hopi wedding dress that her grandmother had made, while Kale dressed in the finest clothing his family possessed. The ceremony itself blended traditions from both cultures, with blessings spoken in 3 languages and vows that honored both individual happiness and community harmony. Thomas served as the host and, in some ways, as a father figure to both bride and groom. He had provided not just employment for Ayana, but protection and respect when she needed them most. For Kyle, he had become a bridge to new opportunities and a model of how people from different cultures could work together successfully. The ceremony, as the celebration continued into the evening with traditional foods, music, and dancing, Thomas pulled the newlyweds aside for a private conversation. I have a proposition for both of you, he said, I've been thinking about expanding the trading post, maybe opening a second location or developing new relationships with communities further south. I could use help from people who understand multiple cultures and can build trust with different groups. He explained that he was offering them a partnership rather than just employment. Kale's knowledge of tribal territories and relationships combined with Ayana's practical skills and understanding of both Hopi and white ways of doing business would be invaluable for the kind of expansion he had in mind. You'd be full partners, Thomas said. Equal shares in any new ventures, equal say in how business is conducted. And this house would be yours. I'm thinking of building something smaller for myself, maybe closer to the main trading post. It was an offer that went far beyond anything either of them had dared to hope for. Not just work, but ownership. Not just acceptance, but full partnership in a growing business. Not just a place to live, but a home they could truly call their own. Kyle and Ayana exchanged a look that spoke volumes. 6 months ago, she had been a victim of systematic abuse with no hope of escape. He had been a hunter who witnessed injustice and chose to act despite the risks. Now they were married partners with a real future and the opportunity to build something meaningful together. We accept, Ayana said simply. As autumn arrived, the new partnership began to take shape. Kyle used his extensive knowledge of tribal territories to map out potential trading routes that no one had tried before. Ayana's practical skills and attention to detail proved invaluable in managing the complex logistics of expanded operations.